And we are live. I got to say, this is a pretty surreal moment in my career. Not necessarily a moment that surprises me. I did a little research back to a post that kind of started my relationship with the fitness industry as a whole. That's, I think I'm going to be a controversial figure no matter how I look at it, just based upon the system that I employ and how what I do, and then how I exclude certain things for certain reasons. But I did some research back onto what kind of started my relationship with the fitness industry, and it was a post on SureDog. And that's an MMA forum, and on this forum, there was a strength and conditioning section, and I wound up putting up a post with an athlete, with a professional fighter, and let's just say the response wasn't necessarily the one I was hoping for. It was a pretty critical response, and it kind of set the tone for what my relationship with the fitness industry was going to be. You guys can look it up. If you just type in Naudi Aguilar, Sherdog, Sherdog, you'll find the origins of that. But anyway, 3 days ago, that was actually the 8-year anniversary of when this all went down, and I'm grateful that it happened. I'm grateful that I get these challenges because it's it ultimately comes down to that if nobody's holding you accountable in life, you might be inclined to want to convince yourself that things are happening or that you're doing good things when you may not be doing good things. And although I will say that the way people came at me wasn't necessarily the most professional, at least it gave me a reality check. And truth be told, I hadn't done any research. Any beyond that, the functional patterns has evolved a thousandfold since 8 years ago, and the craft wasn't really anywhere near where it's at now, and I didn't have as much evidence to suggest that my practice really worked that well anyway. So it was pretty justifiable in many regards to get the reaction that I got from them. Nonetheless, I've been working my ass off to try and get as many results as possible. So then when I finally kind of did get to a point like this, which I had told people 8 years ago, that 7, 8 years ago, that after that particular incident had happened, that I finally understood that I guess I was somewhat radical based upon how people do things, just based upon the fact that I didn't include like Olympic lifting or powerlifting or deadlifts or anything like that in my training. And ultimately, it set the stage for me to understand that, okay, I'm going to eventually have to explain myself. I'm going to have to get better results. Eventually, I'm going to find myself in a situation like this where I'm with a guy, a very prolific figure like Bret Contreras, with a PhD. I mean, all sorts of accomplishments in our field. And so I'm really looking forward to what's going to transpire here. I think there's going to be a lot of learning on my end, hopefully on Bret's end. So this is going to be hopefully a mutual learning process. But never mind that. I think it's going to be very learning for the people that are watching this podcast altogether. And the premise here is I know there's a lot of drama. I know there's a lot of history between Bret and myself, but the premise is I want this to be completely civil. I have a lot of respect for Bret. Bret is a worker. The guy hustles like a madman, and I got to give him credit for that. As somebody who works his ass off too, even if our approaches don't coincide, I can coincide with the guy knowing that he works really hard and I work really hard, and just because of that alone, I can find even that foundation. I can already find some sense of respect for the guy, even if I don't agree with a lot of what he does training wise. Anyway, what I'd like to do is actually get into the introduction of this debate. The problem that I have with debates altogether is that usually it's almost like one person's defending one side or the other. I'm going to ask questions, and if Bret has to correct me on something, I'm open to it. I have no problems with it, so long as it's practical and so long as it's applicable to what I'm trying to do with the people that I train. So I have nothing against that. The problem with debates too is I wish I was a better speaker. If I was a better speaker, this would become a much better process for me. I'm not a great speaker, but I think I am a very good doer. I'm good at committing my actions, and I think the base of results that I've showcased have kind of proven that. And so really what's changed from 8 years ago or 4 years ago until now, from 4 years ago, from when Bret had instituted his debate, or set me up, sorry. When Bret put forth the challenge to me to a debate, I've been working really hard to try and get some results. And I'll say that the industry, especially in about the last 3, 4 years, has changed substantially, especially the last 2, 3 years. And many more people are starting to employ functional patterns training directly, not just functional patterns type exercises, but functional patterns exercises. And I think that the that the efficacy of the practice is proving its merits, which is fundamentally why the response that I got in the outset is not necessarily correlating to the responses that I'm getting today. So I think that's something that I really want to emphasize, is that 4 years ago and 8 years ago, I was operating in a very different fitness industry than I am now. 4 or 8 years ago, to say that a back squat was dangerous or that it was unsustainable was heresy. Today, it's not. I don't get a lot. If I make a post like that to trigger a little bit of controversy, I don't get that same kind of response anymore. People generally tend to be pretty respectful. They tend to be pretty inquisitive. There's not a lot of insults or anything like that. Occasionally, you'll get trolls here and there that pop up, but it's like down. I mean, before I would get hundreds of people commenting, something would get shared on another Facebook page or something like that, but. And then you'd have like 100 people that would comment there saying, this guy's an idiot or whatever. But as of now, things have changed substantially. And I think the main reason that that's happened is that we've been able to showcase a pretty wide array of results. Now, they're not perfect. It's not like completely a perfect practice. So I can't sit there and tell somebody that, hey, look, this is the final frontier of what's going on. I'm still scratching at the surface of what I'm trying to learn, of what I want to do. Until I can get grandma to do a backflip, I'm not going to be satisfied. So the premise is I got to get myself to do backflips functionally before I can really determine that. But nonetheless, I've showcased a great deal of progress with the clients that I've had. And never mind that, the trainers that I train and the trainers that they train and the trainers that they train are getting phenomenal results with their clients. So now we've surmounted thousands of results all over the world. And if you guys have any doubts about what I'm talking about, or if you have any uncertainty as to what it is that I'm talking about, I would invite that you go to my functional patterns page and you look at the actions that we've shown. If you can look at the results, that's going to be what's really going to tell the tale here. It's the results, because the only thing that really matters at the end of the day are results. I don't really care about a scientific study unless it's going to get me results, which is fundamentally why I haven't necessarily partaken in what's accepted by science, or what people. I don't necessarily, and I have some questions with regard to that with you, Bret, with regard to the science, because maybe I don't fully understand it. Maybe my guys don't fully understand it, even though they do have degrees and whatnot, and they know how to read articles. But there's some questions that I'm going to have with you with regard to that. But the premise is that a long time ago, I predicted that people were going to get injured, and they did get injured. And I don't want to let the industry off the hook for that, because I don't want the patterns to repeat again. Because every once in a while, when I do see those trolls come back and they'll be like, look, man, I do the heavy back squats. I put the belt around my waist and I feel great. And you can't help but notice that they're about 25 years old. And I'm thinking, what are you going to feel like when you're 45 years old, bro? What's going to happen then? So I want to prevent the cycle from repeating over and over again. And I want people to, at least, even if they continue to do the back squats, just think about it. Take it as a thought experiment to ask yourself, is this really the optimal way to actually condition human beings? Never mind that. What I find that's interesting on social media is that so often we see people projecting things about themselves and about their lives that aren't necessarily accurate. So the dilemma that comes with science or anything in life is that everybody's always doing a sales job. We're all doing sales jobs. We're all trying to sell ourselves, and rarely do we ever bring about the points where we screw up in training. We rarely ever go down that path. And I'm guilty of this myself. Anything that I'm talking about, keep this in mind, guys, I'm not seeing this as if I'm somehow exempt from this rule or from this idea. I am fully, I realize that I fall within this category as well, and I fight it every single day of my life to ensure that I'm actually giving people relevant material that's actually going to help them with their life. So a big problem of what happens is, for the longest time, I would put forth my ideas, and then people would say, well, I feel great, so I don't care what you have to say. I'm going to keep doing 1 rep maxes like crazy. I'm going to orient my training around the sagittal plane, and I don't care what you say. And I would keep an eye on their accounts about 2-3 years later, because I would save the URL. I know you guys are probably going to think I'm weird, but I would save the URL and to see their profiles, and I could slowly begin to see the trends changing because these people were suffering from injuries. Never mind the fact that there was a lot of industry leaders with many, many followers then saying, I've gotten injured doing traditional training as well. And that critique has subsided because I've made these predictions. And I don't want to have to predict this again. At some point, this has to stop. At some point, people need to start becoming wiser about what they're doing with their body. Otherwise, I think there's going to be grave consequences to society as a whole, in the sense that there's not many people really that are in shape. If you look at the percentile of people that work out to people who don't work out, I think it demonstrates how ineffective traditional training is towards getting people into shape. Because if it feels that uncomfortable to do, there's something wrong. And if there's something that's really cool about functional patterns is that it's fun to do. And it's not that it's fun, it feels good to do. When you do a corrective exercise properly, when you do a chamber sequence properly, it feels amazing. And that's really the premise of what I want to what I want to focus on is that we need to get everybody involved when it comes to getting in shape. And I'm gonna make two more points here. Then I'll get you into your introductory statements, Brett. Sorry if I'm going a little too far here. Um, what I'd like to do is conduct scientific studies. I'd be more than happy to run a comparative analysis as to compare functional patterns to just about anybody. Whether it happens today, tomorrow, a year from now, 2, 3, 4 years from now, I have no doubts. If we get more time, it gives me more time to touch up my craft and make and cover up all the bases, all the patches in my theories and my application. So if I get more time for when I conduct that scientific study, I will be more prepared, and I am very, very certain that we're going to knock it out of the ballpark when that moment comes. I know once we run a comparative analysis on a study that we are going to smash it. This isn't like homeopathy or something like that, where it's something bogus, or even something like acupuncture. This is not an alternative like the alternative medicine stuff. What functional patterns is something that's rooted in science. It's rooted in some degree to it's an objectively based perspective, and there's certain foundations that I look at when it comes to understanding the human organism. And I'm going to be more elaborately detailing this as we go along with this debate. To finalize my initial statement, my initial introduction, if human beings, about 20,000 years ago, if there was a human being, and this is in a small plot in Australia, if we could have a human that could run 28 miles per hour, if a person could run 23 miles per hour in the sand, and then if some scientists could transfer that over and saying this is how fast a person would run if they were on the track, and they concluded that that a human being would probably run at 28 miles per hour, and they didn't use traditional training to accomplish that, I at some level I am going to remain unconvinced that traditional training is really needs to be there for us to resolve people's problems and to get everybody on board with moving better. So the premise is that I don't think you necessarily have to go down the traditional weight training path, or even a lot of the traditional paths. Some of them are good, and don't get me wrong. I do a lot of the traditional stuff myself, but I mix it with what I do, and I modify it, and I relate it to human biology. But what I will say is that a deadlift, a back squat, arguably even a hip thruster, they're not going to take us to the fullest spectrum that we're supposed to go when it comes to accomplishing things as humans. And I think if we want to get to that same phase as to what we once were at some point as human beings, it's going to take much more intelligent thinking than the way that we're going about it right now. So at this point, Brett, I guess I'm kind of done with my introductory statements. You can have at it, brother.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I don't think you're a bad speaker, so I think it comes natural to you. So don't shortchange yourself there. And I
Thank
don't
you,
have any
bro.
debate.
Thank you.
I have zero debate experience. In fact, you're the first person that ever accepted a debate from me, and I've challenged about probably 5 people who are bashing my methods. And to me, debate is a big component of learning. And when someone doesn't accept a debate, then it it makes me question their integrity, because what do you have to lose? It's, you got to be out there and open, and so many people are so afraid to get on a podcast or whatever, show up and get on a debate, and all we can do is learn from it. So I'm glad we're doing this, Naudi, and I can relate to your experiences in the industry, because I popularized hip thrust and a lot of other glute training methods. And like you said, back in the days when Facebook was still popular, people would share a post of mine, and I'd read all these powerlifters bashing hip thrusts or anything, bands or anything else I was using, and I'd have to just sit there and read 50 people making fun of my methods, when deep down I know they work for what I'm trying to do.
They were
But
making
here's
fun of your
why.
methods?
Oh yeah, I've
Wow.
I think I've probably been made fun of more than any popular person in our industry, just because it's I think you've said that about yourself, but whenever
Yeah.
you're introducing something, whenever you're introducing something new, it gets it gets a lot of flack from, when you're breaking the norm. But this is why it's important to do research. So, for example, when I started formulating my theories around like hip thrust making you faster, we were using this invention I made called the scorcher, which basically I took the rounded pad from the glute ham raise and you put your back on that. And then I had a foot platform angled that you put your feet on and you'd sink really deep and then come back up. But it stretches your hamstrings. You feel it working your whole posterior chain. But the scorcher is a very clunky piece of equipment. I'm actually might start selling them, but I don't think many people are going to buy them because the thing's going to cost like 1,900 bucks or something crazy, and to do one exercise off of it. Nevertheless, I love it, and I hadn't. So when I came out with my ebook, I'm like, I need to teach people how to do this without using this machine. It never occurred to me that you could just use a bench. So everyone started using benches, and when I started using the bench, I knew it was just different. You could use more load, but you felt it more in the quads. You didn't feel as much in the hamstrings. You didn't get as much of a stretch, but at least I could have the masses start doing it that way. Well, just last week, me and my trainers, I showed them barbell hip thrusts off the scorcher for the first time, and they sank down deep. They had to use 315. They couldn't even use, they could do 500-pound hip thrusts, but they're remarking how much harder it was, and how much more they felt it working their hamstrings. But my theories were based on the scorcher, and then I started teaching the barbell hip thrust from the bench, and then my theory was that they're going to help increase sprint speed because uh, your chance when you're sprinting, your chance to influence your speed is when you're in contact with the ground. So during ground contact, your hip angle is more related to end range hip extension compared to like a squat where it's the hardest part is down deep. And so that was my theory. So I conducted the first study on hip thrust and acceleration, and it was my colleagues actually helped me carry it out in New Zealand, and they showed that hip thrust led to better sprinting speed improvements than front squats, and this was in adolescent male rugby players. And so to me, that was evidence. Hey, hip thrusts work. They work better, improving speed. So then the next two studies showed that hip thrust didn't improve speed. The next two studies published, one was I think in the UK researchers, and the other was I think it was Japanese researchers. They both had people do hip thrust. They got stronger at hip thrust. They did not get better at sprinting. So that's where I was like, huh? How can that be? It challenged what I thought. So I'm biased because I invented the thing. So it's hard for me. You're always going to have it's like I don't see this through the same lens as other people because I
And,
want so badly.
and by the way, Brett, I think it's cool that you're willing to admit that. I'm wondering if I think so much of what you do, bro, is you try and do things the right way. Even when you conducted the study and you showcased, because the changes weren't massive, but you conducted the studies and you were very honest about what you were saying. So I just wanted to acknowledge you on that, man.
Thanks. So I can read the studies and I'm going, well, like one of the studies they used a really slow tempo. If you want to improve your speed, you got to be explosive, and the way we do them is more explosive. And then, well, they didn't really have a tapering period, so if you're going to hammer them for 8 straight weeks and then test them in speed, they're fatigued. They're not going to do their best. You got to give them a tapering week or a week off or something. But anyway, I'm not as critical with other studies as I am with those studies, because when it doesn't come out the way you want, you get really good at criticizing, but I'm aware of that. But anyway, then another study came out just recently showing that they did improve speed better than back squats. So now it's 2-2. And there are a couple other studies showing improvements in jumping and good correlations with sprinting, but correlation doesn't imply causation. So anyway, now we're at a kind of like we need more research. So when you talk about wanting a study to be undertaken with functional patterns, methodology, you really want, you know, you need like 20 studies, and then you have a meta-analysis, and then you have
Yeah,
reviews
of
and
course.
meta-analyses and things like that. It's like one study can only do so much. And they're also, because you were talking about studies, how there's limitations of them. And the one thing is, we can never, when you have methods, they have to be duplicable. And so you have to stick to this rigid methodology. And that's not what we do when, as personal trainers. You know, Naudi, when you and I train people, we make adjustments on the fly based on what we're seeing. You can't do that in the study. So let me give you an example of, no, I have my PhD. I've published, I think, 50 studies, and I love research, but I will be the first person to say we use the scientific method. In you know, you have to control the variables, and so you can't just do what we do in personal training. For example, let's say I start training someone, and you know, I'm giving them whatever. I'm not going to load them up with like a heavy barbell the first time I have them squat. The first time I have them squat, I might have them do body weight box squats going real deep to like pull one on my box squat. Or maybe I put a dumbbell in the goblet position. I'm not going to just throw a heavy bar on their back. On the fourth week I put a barbell on their back, or actually maybe I have them do front squats before back squats or something. And then maybe one day I see they're like beat up and they're not moving too well. Well, I'm going to switch. I'm going to either do higher reps or switch exercise variations or do something with hip thrusts. I'm not trying to get them to do heavy weight right away. I'm teaching them with body weight, get them to feel their glutes contracting, things like that. And I'm sure you can relate in the stuff that you do. You're not trying to say you're getting them some rotational thing on the cable column. You're not trying to load them up. You're trying to get them to move well and get the right feel. But in the studies, what you'll typically see
Well,
is you'll
Brett,
say, okay,
I'll elaborate more deeply on that later on, bro, because I have to explain a lot because I don't showcase what we do most of the time in terms of correcting people online. Just real quick, I'll explain more as to what I'm doing. Maybe it might be something that you might want to check out if I'm ever in San Diego or if you're ever in Hawaii and you'd ever want to like compare notes and I could show you, then you might like look at what
you're in
I'm doing. Then
Hawaii
you
now?
I am, bro. I am. I had to. My health needed it. I could have moved to Mexico. I lived in San Diego for all those years, but I was like, I needed kind of like a smaller town vibe. And based upon what I needed at this given moment, man, I was like, Hawaii seemed like the right choice for me. So if you're ever around, you're more than welcome to come by the gym, and I'd be happy to show you what I'm doing. I'll go into deeper explanations because there's a lot that I have to explain. Just an FYI. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead, Brett. Sorry.
Well, let me finish this point and then I'm done. So,
Yeah, for sure.
so what we'll typically do is we'll take, you know, either it's beginners or experienced lifters, whatever, and then the definition. What's the definition of an experienced lifter? That's hard to define. Some people say it's 1 year of training. Some people it's a strength standard. But anyway, say I take a beginner. Say my study looks at beginners, and I take them and I get I have to prescribe them a load. So I 1 rep max them before I get the longitudinal study underway. So we test their 1 rep max. How many people can do a good 1 rep max when they haven't even ever done barbell squats before or deadlifts? What's that 1 rep max going to look like? So you'll 1 rep max them, and that's subjective too. Well, you know, if they're doing a squat, is it to parallel? What if they butt wink like crazy before they get to parallel? What if their knees cave in? It's hard to. Is it a pretty looking squat? Like, how do you define? So you have to define your standards. But anyway, if they meet the requirements and you test their 1 rep max, say this newcomer gets, you know, say it's a female and she squats 100 pounds. Okay, the very next week you typically dive into the program, the training program. So then you're being prescribed a load. Maybe it's 5 sets of 5 with 80% of 1 rep max. Well, how is she going to do well with 5 by 5 with 80 pounds? She should be doing body weight squats and goblet squats, and we're easing her way into it. You wouldn't just throw someone right into heavy barbell training right off the bat and with the sole goal of progressive overload for 6 straight weeks. You're just hammering them with progressive overload, and then you test them on whatever the things you pre-test them on, whether it's a 10 or 20 meter or 40 meter or 100 meter, whatever say it's sprint acceleration or a vertical jump, a broad jump, an agility test, some measure of rotational power or something, like you retest them on that. And that doesn't mimic what we do as a personal trainer. That doesn't mimic what we do. So I don't think you can get a study to fully mimic what we do as personal trainers. It'll never be as effective as the actual personal trainer can be, because it takes away the feedback we see, the auto regulation that we do, it's an art, and good personal trainers know that art very well. So I don't think we'll ever be able to, um, unless you publish case studies and things like that. But the problem with case studies is that you can have genetic outliers. There's a whole body of research on, you give 20 people the same program, you'll have one person over here respond like crazy, and this person over here see no results at all. They call them non-responders. And so that's why case studies need to be taken, not taken as gospel, and considered with precaution. But anyway, there's an inherent flaw with all studies. But the flip side is we just have the wild, wild west where everyone's just out there. Every blogger, every Instagrammer is just making these claims. How do we know if there's truth to it? So that's why we should care about research and try to be scientific as possible and publish studies, knowing that there's always going to be limitations.
Absolutely, and I think it's awesome that you're elaborating on things like this, Brett, because even in my community, even I thought you were like true, full on like science, science, science. If it's not evidence based, and it's irrelevant or whatever. Because at the end of the day, it really comes down to the fact that you have to be adaptable when you're working with somebody. Like I have a very different way of going about things, and as we go along through this discussion, I'll talk more about how I go about things. But you won't really understand it. It's like what I'm trying to do is codify gait, and then I'm developing resistance training protocols that relate to gait. So I would literally like take the gait cycle, put it in slow motion, slightly suspend a human body in space, and then get it to actually perform the function of hip extension, knee extension, pelvic rotation with knee extension, hyperextension. I'll take any function, and I can just switch on a thing like that pretty damn quick in terms of functions on the body, and create a massive. We just got EMGs recently, and we were showcasing that we could get peak glute contraction, peak muscle contractions, just using what these things that I call IMAPs or chambers. It's just words to describe them, but I would call them IMAPs. And so kind of with what they do is they connect the body. What's your opinion on the anatomy train system from Tom Myers? Have you researched anything on that, Brett?
So like when you look at the Anatomy Trains book, it makes so much sense. You see these nice fascial trains and meridians, whatever you call them, where it flows right into the other, the lat going right into the opposite glute, things like that. Well, I've been skeptical because I wonder if when you actually go to to dissect a cadaver and things and start peeling back layers, I wonder if it's that pretty. I wonder if I've
Well,
seen I've been in a few anatomy labs, dating back from when I was in college, but also in the last 5 years, I've gone a couple times just to see things about like the glutes, like you'll hear textbooks say the lower glute max is an adductor. And I'm like, how could it be an adductor? It would have to attach on the inner portion of the femur to do that, and it doesn't. But anyway, I don't think it's always as nice and neat as it's brought out to be. But there's a lot of research on that. I have a whole folder on like myofascial force transmission.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's like they've done studies showing you can like sever like the fascia between two muscles, and it greatly diminishes the force because they work together within a pocket. So I know that it's important. I just don't know what we can do to influence it. Like if there's one type of, I remember Tom Myers speaking for Perform Better, and he was talking about training, and it's like, okay, that's stuff we all do anyway. But I don't know if you can influence it. It's like the fascia develops with the muscles. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, well, you can influence it, and I think we found a way to do it, and we found a way to find a regression analysis to get it to influence on most people. So long as the person puts in the work, we're actually able to pull this off. And this is one thing that maybe in the future I could show you. It's something that I developed about I've been working on it, I think, for if I backtrack long enough, I think like 6 years, and it's kind of like an exponential. Like it just kind of starts super 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 slow, and then eventually it's like it just takes off, and I'm at that
Well, real
phase
quick,
right.
now, you're talking about it. You see them improve their function, so you assume that it's the fascial adaptations.
That's my assumption. My assumption is that the myofascial force transmission is getting improved based upon the fact that I could see. Let's say, for example, if you see somebody running on a treadmill and you see when their foot hits the ground, when they're about to have the ground force reaction tension, and you'll see that the pelvis will, like, let's say if you measure out the ratio between like the hip extension, the amount that you're going to get of hip extension going back this way, and the amount of pelvic rotation, hip hike, and lateral pelvic shift that you're going to get coupled with that, if it's disproportional, you're going to just see the leg kind of go fixed, and then you're going to see the hip jam up. But when they become proportional to one another, you're going to see that they all kind of move with each other. And that's what ultimately leads me. You can almost see like a ripple effect that happens through the lat and all the way down to the ipsilateral oblique, all the way down to the contralateral glute. You'll start to see these ripple patterns begin to happen. And what that suggests to me is that we're actually starting to get to that point where we're able to improve myofascial force transmission. Again, I don't show this publicly, Brett, because let me just put it this way. There's a lot of controversy there's a lot of controversy showcased around it. About myself and what I do, that it looks like clown dancing or whatever. People have a lot of suppositions as to what it is that I do, but I intentionally have kept this out. So when we do conduct a scientific study, I'll be like, look, I don't want to be greedy. I don't want to come off as greedy, but I want to make sure that functional patterns and all the people that are in FP that are pushing this so hard and working so hard get the credit for what is there. And these chamber sequences are really going to be the game changer. I know I
The
we're
one thing, as a scientist, um, well, I consider myself more a lifter first, then a personal trainer, then a scientist. But anyway, the scientist aspect of me would say it could also be just neural, like coordination improvements with the
potentially.
timing and sequences of muscle activation. So that's why you
Yes,
always have to be
exactly,
open-minded,
bro.
saying it might be the myofascial force transmission, or it could be, oh, it could also be,
Beef
you
bone
know,
force
there's
transmission.
not, it could be like the tendon, it could be improved muscle activation, it could be muscle strength, it could be, I would think it'd be more coordinative improvements. Just there's a lot of like,
Yeah, and
sometimes things
I
that
get what
seem
you're
obvious,
saying.
like when people have it's called like Trendelenburg gait or something, where the the hip drops tremendously. You think that's obvious. They have a weak gluteus medius, and then you test gluteus medius strength, and it's not always correlated with that. That tells me it's a motor pattern aberration and motor pattern sequencing. So to fix that, you would need some sort of, probably the stuff that you do. But anyway, it could be myofascial force transmission, or it could just be improvements in coordination or
Absolutely.
strength.
I've thought about which I think is awesome that you're bringing that up, bro, because I've thought about the same thing. It's just the fact that the muscles are probably just working more harmoniously with one another, and it could be absent of the idea of the myofascial force transmission. So I'm completely on board with what you're saying there. But the premise of kind of like how I go about it when it comes to training people and how I change things, it's like that there's common denominators between high level athletes and how they run. So like, for example, like anytime you're looking at, let's say, like hip extension or hip flexion or something, at some point you're going to notice the pelvis and the rib cage incorporate a rotation along with that hip flexion or hip extension. And oftentimes you'll also notice a lateral flexion of the spine, a lateral tilt of the cranium. You'll see, or even a lateral shift of the pelvis as you're potentiating the extension. So essentially what I found is that if you're missing these particular functions and not accounting for how they all are supposed to coincide, that's what leads to these problems happening all together. So the reason that we change this all the time, we show about 2.5 years ago, I was looking at this going like, oh my God, what am I going to do about this? It was like, it was the test of my career, Brett. This was like, okay, if I can showcase a change here, I think I can make a case to showcase that, I'm not a fraudulent con artist. Like here is the change. And it was from that point on that I could show that ground force reaction almost consistently. It's the dilemma just comes down to whether the clients want to partake in this or not, because they might be inclined to be like vanity oriented and they don't want to focus on just trying to fix their mechanics. But if they focus on it, we could almost fix this on just about everyone. So long as they're a willing participant and they really trust in the system, we can actually change this. And so, what I've been looking at are the most common denominators involved with high level runners. So, if I look at like Usain Bolt, Justin Gatlin, Carl Lewis, even if I look at like NFL football players, like the most influential one on me is Barry Sanders. I love watching that guy. I've been watching him since he was a kid, or since I was a kid. And
He was my favorite football
amazing. I mean, what he would do with his body is absolutely incredible. And so, what I've managed to do is slow down the sequences of what Barry Sanders does or a Usain Bolt does, so anybody can access that. So when I reposition the body, let's say if you're doing hip extension, let's say you're gonna do like what if you put an ankle strap on and you're gonna do a hip extension, where your pelvis is rotated in the context of when that hip extension is happening is gonna be really important in terms of how much muscular fatigue you're gonna put onto somebody. So like for me, I can literally induce a one max. I can create a failure with a muscle almost moving no weight, just depending on how I sequence it. And what's most fascinating about all of it is that the closer it approximates to the gait cycle in terms of what Usain Bolt does, the more trauma that gets induced. It's absolutely fascinating, and this is what I've been working on. So when I look at something like that, I'm able to code it now much more effectively. There's still so many things that I'm missing. There's still so many times where I'm like, what the hell am I going to do about that? But in general, these are things that we're actually able to correct on a pretty regular basis in terms of, and we showcase it in our results all the time. If you go to our Instagram, you'll see kind of the results that we showcase. We've been showcasing this on stuff with like on people like with neurological problems, people with autism. We cover all spectrums as well as high level professional athletes. So we're going across that whole spectrum. But I think at this point it would be good. I want to keep this at around 90 minutes, Brett. We're probably not going to be able to get through all this stuff because it's like even trying to unpack all the concerns that you had regarding the initial challenge. I think a lot of it I can kind of just pack. A lot of these I can kind of just say, hey, like I can answer it pretty quickly. I'll see how far we can get through this, if that's okay with you, if we can kind of move on into that whole thing.
yeah,
Um,
let's bring him through it, yeah.
okay, so do you have the list in front of you in terms of what you wanted to read off in terms of what's there, and then like, kind of like just give me what your concerns were, and never mind that. Have your presumptions changed about training in the last 4 years? Has anything changed in terms of what you believe from 4 years ago to today?
Yeah, so I think uh, for me, like for example, my gym glute lab, we've had 0 injuries in 13 months, maybe 14 months. The trainers have gotten hurt, just not our clients. Um, uh, but I think the reason why, okay, let's talk about squats and deadlifts. The reason why they are dangerous is twofold. Number one, you can move a ton of weight, but you're going down deep in positions that stretch things out, and they create a lot of muscle force. You're going to have compression on the joints, and there's just if something goes wrong in maybe an isolation movement, it's not going to be as dangerous as when something goes wrong when you've got a ton of weight on your back or in your hands and you're bent over or in a deep flex positions. But that's only one aspect of it. The probably even more important than that, because you could, if Naudi, if you and I just went in and squatted with never tracking what we do, we just went in and tried to get a couple of good sets in, we'd always be fine, probably. It's the progressive overload that's dangerous. And it happens to all of us. Probably you, back when you did heavy weights, you go up, and then you have that day where you're not feeling real good. But you push it anyway. And sometimes you set a PR and you get away with it. Try that 2 or 3 workouts in a row, you're going to injure yourself. Well, with squats and deadlifts, people care so much about what they lift. So that's your vanity lift. That's your, you put that on Instagram, you get street cred. So I don't lie. If I'm like going to do a seated row or something, I don't care I'm not like, oh crap,
Yeah,
I'm not
exactly.
feeling good, I'm going to do it. But if it's a deadlift, especially if you're like, you planned that PR, you're like, I took a week off. I tapered, I ate well, I slept well all weekend. I start warming up, I feel good. I know I'm going to set a PR, and then you go for your first couple of specific warm ups, and it just doesn't feel right. It's really hard to then just go, hey, I don't have it today. I'm not going for it. Many times you just will anyway, and you lie to yourself, and you'll injure yourself, and you'll always be able to look back and go, my body was giving me warning signs, I ignored them. So it's the two lifts that people care about the most are squats and deadlifts. You could say bench press with males, but those, and that's, it's the fact that people care about them the most that makes them the most dangerous. You don't listen to your body. You don't say, if I just went in and did lifts without progressive overload component, without trying to get stronger at them, and just did, one day you do a goblet squat, just do a couple sets, really keeping really good form and trying to feel the right muscles do the work. And then the next time you did this, and as long as you had a very balanced routine, you'd probably be all right. But anyway, what I did with Glute Lab was I just said, we're not going to have that many people do heavy squats and deadlifts. We'll give them goblet squats. We'll give them kettlebell deadlifts. We'll have them use some of our machines because no one cares what they can lift off the machines. You're not obsessed with, it's not a number, 315 or something like that, And and then we put the focus more on other exercise, the hip thrust variations, a lot of different movements that aren't typically as dangerous. And for that reason, we've had less number of injuries. And if I think back to my last glute squat in Phoenix, we had more injuries and more, not severe injuries, but just aches and pains. My girls would be like, my hip hurts, my knee hurts, my low back isn't feeling good. And I'd have to make, I don't hear that in my clients. So I had to make adjustments. So I've chilled out on the heavy barbell lifts more. I still love them. It's just that it's better when you have like a one-on-one coach, and you need an objective person there with you to do well at them.
But
So
don't you think that's a
probably
problem though? Like you don't think that, like, why do you think the glute max formed in the first place? Why do you think the lats formed the way they did in the first place on humans, Brett? Like, what is your supposition? Because that's a big thing. Because at some point we're probably going to get into the mind muscle connection. But I'm of the belief that a muscle exists because a function drove its existence to begin with. So there was never a chimp that said, I want to have a glute max and then start developing that. So do you believe that the gluteus maximus exists primarily because of running and throwing? Do you think that's a somewhat valid argument? Or if it's not those functions, what functions do you think it was that took a chimpanzee, if the theory is correct about that, which I think it is? I think that the evidence is pretty strong to suggest that we did evolve likely from chimps, maybe bonobos, just because we're such close genetic ancestors. But if we actually develop the glute max to what it is, what I operate under the presumption that the glute max was formed by running and throwing, that those functions are the ones that built it. And the foible that I have with deadlifts and back squats is that they don't relate to those functions at all. And prior to gym culture, those movements weren't really that much of a focal point. If you pick something up, it's different than actually doing a deadlift. Like grabbing an object and using your pecs to squeeze in on it, and then like elevating your shoulders to kind of like use your upper traps to stabilize yourself, and then extend your body against that force. Like the forces are different. It seems like or not seems like, they are different when you're holding something opposed to when you're doing a deadlift. So the question I ask is, how are a deadlift and a back squat relevant if, at least for me, it's clear that the development of the glutes, the posterior chain, the anterior chain, virtually all the muscles are highly dependent on running and throwing specifically. Obviously, we could throw in upright standing posture. We could throw in walking dynamics. All those things contribute. But if I think about what's the most intense and impactful on the body in terms of trauma, I would have to say that running and throwing are probably the most important functions that we've developed. And I just don't see how a deadlift and a back squat coincide with that.
So to answer your first question, this is my kind of like my greatest passion as a researcher is obviously the glutes. So I can I can look at my glute studies here, and I've got 1.7 gigabytes. I wonder if it tells me how many files are in here. But I've got all the research, just like almost every major paper written on the glutes. Yeah, I have over 2,000 studies in this folder here. And one day I hope to publish a review paper on gluteus maximus. But that is a big theory postulated by Lieberman. He wrote that the glutes evolved from running. I don't agree with his opinion. I think largely in part from running, but I actually think it was like the primates that we like you start out as like hominids, and then I don't know the exact train of
Neither do
evolution,
I.
but
I don't
as we
understand the whole specifics of it either. So yeah, just yeah, you're good.
but as we began walking more upright, and I know there's different theories for how we began being upright and stuff. Like one theory was that the sun only hits the top of your head now instead of your whole body. One theory was to like um, be able to go through the marshes and stuff better. One was just so we could stand taller and see our predators. One was
Hmm.
for running. One was there's like a bunch of different theories, but I just think it's for running long distances or covering long distances, it's more economical than being on all fours. And as we became more upright, the moment arms, like the that you use for end range hip extension, it becomes better, more advantageous for the glutes, and so you're going to activate it more because the glutes are now naturally more involved. At least in these ranges, they for some reason the brain activates the glutes higher at end range hip extension compared to flex range hip extension, which we don't know why. Nobody knows why at this point. And
So
then
okay,
it's this
say that
combination.
again.
You get your highest EM like when next time you test EMG activity on someone, it's really fascinating. You can have them get down in like a squat position or a flex position, say fire your glutes as hard as possible, then have them stand up and say fire your glutes as hard as possible. You'll get much higher EMG activity from a standing position when they're at end range.
Hmm.
And that's not the same with other muscles. Like the biceps will be
You can
mid
contract
range.
whenever.
The quadriceps are in a more stretched position. They're not at end range, like lockout knee extension, and that's something that fascinates me. And I don't know why. I tried probably 6 years ago. I emailed like 20 researchers, and they all had different answers. And but I could quickly dismiss their answer because like one of them said that's to count for sarcomere length, and I'm like, then every muscle would behave that way. So, but anyway, I think it was a combination of everything, like us being upright and then learning that it's actually very useful um, for running, for picking things up, for sitting,
You
squatting
don't
up and down, for
you don't think there's
lunging,
a
for
hierarchy?
I do think there's a hierarchy, but it's not just what it's most used for. Because God, there's a paper on this. Because of the angle of the glute fibers, um, like relative to like the SI joint, for example,
Hmm.
like they cross the SI joint very, like the SI joint is a triangle, and then you have the glute fibers, so they really close off that SI joint well, but they also transfer to rotation. Like I think it's 71% of the force transfers right into rotation. And when I did EMG of the glute max, it gets fired really hard during rotation.
Yeah,
But then
absolutely.
you have to,
There's a premise to consider that whenever you do hip extension, at some point your hip is going to also rotate with hip extension. So the hips aren't going to stay square; they're actually going to rotate, and you're going to finish extension. So that's probably what's going to tell you why those lines of continuity likely exist at like that whenever you're promoting that kind of muscle activity. So yeah, you're going to get more. I would imagine that you're going to get more glute max activation with hip rotation, right?
you get tons with hip rotation. What's interesting though is that in sports, it's funny because I'm the glute guy, and I didn't realize this till probably like 6 years ago. I think I was before I presented for NSCA. I always thought of like jumping is hip extension, sprinting is hip extension, cutting side to side is hip abduction, and then swinging is hip external rotation. And then I'm like, no, if you're swinging a bat, for example, if you're going to swing a bat or throw a strike, you're actually, you know, you're like this. You're loaded up in flexion and a little bit of internal rotation. And then as you swing, you carry out the three actions all at once. It's because I'm flexed, here I'm extended. Here I'm like not necessarily adducted, but here I'm abducted, and then I rotate along the
Yep.
way. And it's the same with
Yes.
throwing. So you're kind of combining hip extension, abduction, and external rotation at the same time,
Yes.
which is why I think, which we'll
So,
delve
so, so
into later. But I think there's a hierarchy. Yes, I think that
what's the
certain
hierarchy
actions.
then? Which functions do you think are the? I would guess that it's probably running first and then throwing that develop most of the musculature on the human
I
body. This is
don't
like
think
the
we need to.
this is a claim that
I
I've
think you'd
made.
have to say, okay, but you wouldn't just say what delivers the highest glute mac activation. You'd also say what things we were doing the most. So
Yes,
you'd have
yes,
to take
absolutely.
someone, right? So you have to take someone and like track, like say you had a camera on them, or like say even better, say you had like positional markers on them and you tracked their joint angle movements all day. Then you would say, how many times did they stand up? How many times did they walk? How many times did they run? How many times did they sprint? How many times did they throw something? How many times did they were they climbing? And then you'd calculate all those things, but then you'd also have to factor in how much that activity works the glutes. So I do think
Well,
running was probably running's probably the main one, but also, you know,
walking. I mean, one would imagine walking
well,
has
the thing is
has a lot to
walking,
do with it, right?
I don't think walking activates the glutes to like just a, not even 5% of MVIC. So it's not developing a hypertrophy stimulus. I think uh, when you
Well, I
go
think if you measure
faster,
how people walk too, that's a lot of it too. People's gait cycles aren't. I mean, this is what I spend my time doing is measuring the gait cycle. So people's walking gait wouldn't contract the glutes very much. Like I can get people to walk and actually really feel their glutes based upon how I make adjustments on them. But another thing
well,
that,
that's a whole other topic, Naudi, is walking, like power walking, how you can walk. Well, think of kettlebell swings, like the RKC, like that hard style swing versus like just swing. What's the like the Gilroy? I don't know what the one that's for the test for endurance. They have a totally different style. Well, it's just like if I do a quote unquote like proper deadlift, it's way harder for me than to just round back it up because I'm really good at round backing because one's more economical than the other. So I'm not sure if we're getting someone to walk a very long distance, that's a whole other debate of which is the most economical way. And I'm not saying your way is not better for that. It might be that it's better for like performance and not long endurance, if that makes sense. So that's
yeah,
another
I
thought.
mean, we test this stuff pretty frequently with people who run and whatnot. I mean, I still operate under the presumption that there is a hierarchy, and it's when I think about where the human organism originated, it was out of Africa, and it seems to be that it was mainly on the savannah. So my presumption is that we were probably doing a lot of running, which is why running and probably throwing at some point. I think throwing rocks was happened to be very impactful in our evolution in terms of our ability to succeed. I mean, when you have a whole tribe of humans throwing objects at a lion or something like that, one would think that would be pretty effective for survival and whatnot. So I still operate under that presumption.
This is a area of interest for me too. So like maybe like a lot of the I have no idea. Maybe a lot of the women and a lot of the men sat around and like
Mm,
picked berries or something. I don't even know if there were berries in the savannah, but like maybe they were more like the gatherers, and then you had the hunters
yep.
that were really had to be in good shape, and they were the ones responsible for hunting down this saber-toothed tiger or woolly mammoth. But here's what's interesting about evolution, and this is the main kind of like a big maybe the biggest um, divide between functional patterns. And because I hear you, Nadi, you're saying like you might like if you and I were just friends that hung out, you'd say, Bret, why do you do this to yourself? Why do you just hurt yourself doing hip thrusts last month, and then the year before that it was squats, and then the year before that you hurt your back doing deadlifts. Why do you do this to yourself? Um, and you say that like bodybuilding, powerlifting, these are vanity things. And while I appreciate that, and I can go, yeah, I actually wish that it wasn't so like you're saying that humans should evolve to not care about these vanity things so much.
No, no,
But
no. Hold on. Can I just interject real quick?
yeah, sure.
Brett, I'm right there with you, bro. I want vanity, but I think the function needs to drive the vanity. I think if I don't want to be any human. I want to be the baddest human that's out there. I want to be the guy that's hunting the saber-toothed tiger in terms of movement. And I think if I'm going to do that, I'm going to be really good at sprinting and I'm going to be really good at throwing if I'm going to be doing that. So the premise of where I'm coming from is that I am all about vanity. Everything is about vanity. In the last like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and I'm saying this conservatively so I don't sound like a complete idiot in case it's like anti-science, but I've packed on like 7 pounds of muscle just doing functional patterns movements. I've just tested it and I was like, you know what? It's about time. I've codified running and throwing somewhat well enough to where I could start getting my body to start putting on mass. So I'm about the vanity too. It just has to coincide. But then at some point we also have to ask ourselves,
So
yeah,
you're
yeah, go
only
ahead.
factoring in natural selection, and that's a very important component to evolution. Natural selection. So you know you like so put you and I out there on a mission to hunt down the woolly mammoth, and I don't train for endurance. I don't train. I don't hike well. I can't run long distances. So maybe you can kill that woolly mammoth and maybe I die in the process. And so my genes are weeded out. And then you influence you influence evolution by natural selection that the strongest survive and these characteristics get passed on. But there's also sexual selection. And that's with like the peacock with the fancy feathers, that's gonna get chosen for a mate. And this is a whole other component to evolution is the sexual selection. And it has there's so I think Darwin was the first person to notice this, and then it got expanded by some other researcher. But in humans, think back to why you started lifting as a teenager, Naudi. For me, it was well, most people it's for three reasons. It's number one, they they get tired of being bullied and want to stand up to bullies. Number two, they want to attract females. Or number three, they want or they're told by their coach, you need to start doing this for sports, and it's something you don't even enjoy, but your coach tells you to do it. So for me, that's where the sexual selection comes in. It's like people start lifting, they want to do bodybuilding, they want to feel they want to do the isolation movements and work their pecs and things like that. And I think that's going to be a big obstacle to change if on your mission, Nadia, is how do you disentangle that component from the equation?
Well, the way I'm going to do it is by getting results at it, brother. So that's what I'm working
Well,
on.
yeah,
So it's like whether
but
I do it or not.
does
Yeah.
your system develop all the muscles? Because I don't know enough
Yes.
about the functional pattern systems, but do you
Yes.
train
Yes.
chest? Do you train
So,
biceps, things like that? These vanity muscles?
if I
Does it
was to
work?
ask you, because hypertrophy is directly linked to performance, and I agree with that. I just think that the hypertrophy needs to orient to a particular function. So I guess we can
Actually,
transition it.
it's not that well correlated, and it's there's even one researcher who went so far as to say it's that hypertrophy and strength are completely like
Well,
not
there you
well
go.
correlated. So,
Well,
but it's not as correlated as people think. Now,
okay,
but I
okay.
actually think it's more. It depends on the action, which we can talk about. I actually think it's more important for rotation than anything. But you might disagree. But anyway, that's one of the questions we're supposed to get to. So
Well, what I wanted to get into is that in terms of if you were to compare a marathoner compared to a 100-meter sprinter, what would be the main difference that you would notice in the two in terms of their
yeah,
physicality?
more muscle mass, right?
Yeah, so my theory is, and my hypothesis is that if you can run pain free, and if you could sprint pain free, and if anything, if you can change the mechanics of how you run, that in and of itself will contract all the muscles you need because it's respecting our evolution. If you look at the most common denominator out of all really really good athletes where running is involved, they all run in general. Well, not all of them, but a lot of them run pretty fast. So my premise is that if you can run fast, if you can run more effectively, you could get lean, because if you want to get lean, you just do long distance running. But even you could do interval training too, and that'll get you lean, I'd imagine as well. But then you could also do sprints, and if you do sprints, that's going to build all the muscles. And the whole premise of all the movements that we do at functional patterns is to respect gait. So when we think about like running gait, throwing motions, if all those, if we stress the muscles in a particular, because we are eventually going to get into the whole concept of specificity, whether the hypertrophy is going to transfer over into specific environments. So what I'm saying is that you don't have to blend them. That the specificity itself is the hypertrophy if you understand what the position is. If you understand where to put the position of the entire body, you can get the pec to contract with the oblique and get it to contract with the glute and get it to contract with the adductors and the vastus lateralis. You can make that entire thing and create a, like when you get a pump or a burn working out, I can do the exact same thing. The only difference is that it actually respects the gait cycle. That's the premise. And so within time, what I'm going to do is showcase results that once we're at that cusp. We've already done it. I've already taught enough practitioners to do this. In the next year, we're going to be able to showcase real results on people actually putting on muscle. You'll see it by around February next year, I'll predict, that you're going to start seeing FP practitioners starting to put on more mass. You're going to start seeing their clients put on more mass and that they're going to get leaner, mainly because we're going to be able to they're going to be allowed to run more. If you could sprint at a high velocity, at a high speed, then at that point, all the muscles that are needed to be able to sprint at a high speed and sprint in a way that could be somewhat similar to that of a Usain Bolt, then you're going to have more of a predisposition of looking like a Usain Bolt if you run like a Usain Bolt. You're going to have a higher predisposition of looking like a Carl Lewis if you run like a Carl Lewis. You're going to look like one of these people if you actually move like them. So that's what I mean in terms of vanity. I think that vanity and functionality completely coincide. They're not mutually exclusive. Neither is specificity training and resistance training and hypertrophy. They all coincide perfectly with one another as far as I'm concerned. And that's really what I've been working on. And it comes back to that same premise of that there are hierarchies as they relate to human structure. And if we respect those hierarchies, it gives us an entirely new possibility. Like I said, Bret, I would love to show this to you because if you saw it, I think you as a science guy, as a guy, well, I don't call you a science guy. You seem to be everywhere, bro. I'm all practical application. I don't classify myself as much as a science guy. I'm not a big reader. I'm a kind of guy that's, I'm in the gym. Or in my laboratory working with people and whatnot. And I have people that are on the opposite end of the spectrum that I get to kind of like bounce ideas off with. So I'm over here. You're the guy that's on both ends of the spectrum. You're over here. So I think that this would be a really interesting thing to show you at some point if you'd be open to it, just to show you what I'm doing. Because I think if you felt the sensation, Bret, you'd be like, holy shit, this is very profound. And this is what happens. I can get a whole group of 50 people through a whole week of just brutal beatdowns in terms of training, in terms of of our workouts, and not have a single one of them talk about, they'll literally be like, it's not that I don't feel the pain from doing the workouts. All my pain, it just goes. You did that one chamber sequence, Naudi, and then like my SI joint, it reset. You did that one chamber, and I know it sounds bogus, but I think if I had the opportunity to show it to you at some point, if we ever meet or something like that, Bret, I would love to show it to you just to see. I'd like to see what you think about it ultimately, but I think that there's a grand unified theory that's going to give us everything that we want. We can get the vanity, we can get the functionality, we can get the pain management, and we can prevent injuries. At least contact injuries is a tough one. Preventing contact injuries, that's a pain in the ass. But I think we can definitely do some things to prevent soft tissue injuries. So I think we can get it all if we understand what the human being is fundamentally, and if we work from that foundation, we're gonna be much better off as individuals on multiple levels, from a physical level, from a psychological level, all aspects of our life.
So I'm kind of the opposite. Like I like to geek out with biomechanics. I like to look at why every exercise would be useful, why every muscle should be trained uniquely, why every movement needs its own drills. But this is where science is important. So I am of the opinion that you look at sprinters back before weight training was popular, they weren't nearly as muscular as they are now. I think the weights make the sprinters, I think they'd be lean.
Well,
They wouldn't be as jacked.
I think steroids
Yeah, of
could be
course.
made a case too,
Yeah,
brother. Come on, man. We
yeah,
got to
of
throw that
course.
into the mix too.
So there's that too. But even if you had a sprinter that was natural and he just sprinted, I don't think he'd develop nearly as much muscle mass as he would with weight training. But if you think that your system does that, and you can show, we had, a group of 12 people do this and a group of 12 people do this, and here were the results, and we tested all the muscles. I'm of the opinion that if you want You can look at every muscle group, the delts, the biceps, the triceps, now there are some researchers that think you don't need isolation movements. They've done some studies, but
Mhm.
there's only a few studies on this. They show that the biceps grow just fine when you're just doing chin ups and rows, and the triceps grow just fine when you're doing presses and things like that. But you're saying just with sprinting, I would think that one thing about sprinting is like it's such a rapid motion. The muscles need time to develop maximum tension. They can get like very high levels of EMG activation in a very short time frame, but it's that the the muscles actually need enough time for all the cross bridges to form and develop the maximum tension on the muscle, which maximizes growth. So it's on a spectrum. I think you could probably get 80% of the growth in some muscles, but then like muscles like calves and like quads, glutes, hamstrings from sprinting and things like that. But could you get 100% of the development? No, but then some upper body
I
muscles.
think. Oh no,
They
bro.
could.
Upper body. No, the upper body is incredibly important when it comes to how it relates to the. This is where the myofascial force transmission thing may matter. I was under the presumption a long time ago that the upper body wasn't as involved. That the upper body would be relaxed. It's not necessarily the case at all. If you look at somebody like a Justin Gatlin, I don't think he developed his pecs by doing bench presses. I'm sure you might argue that. I think he developed that based upon how he runs and the arm swinging maneuvers in terms of spiral patterns in the shoulder, spiral patterns in the femurs, and all that stuff. The upper body reciprocates the lower body. So on my end, like I just got I tested myself this morning. I haven't ran in a while. I ran 5 miles this morning, and Bret, I am not a runner. And let me throw this into the mix too, man. I could have been a pretty decent lifter. And weighing, what was I, like 135 pounds? I could bench press near 300 pounds. Not too. It's not great, but it's a decent amount. So I could back squat. I don't remember what I
Really
could
good.
back squat. Yeah, so I have the capacity to be a decent lifter, probably not a great lifter. My sister, I think she had bench pressed 185 pounds. I think she only weighed like 110 pounds for a while because nobody was doing it. She had broken the world record. She had like a little trophy or whatever. So I could have gone down that path, but I chose the path of being a runner. And I'm a 5'4" tiny little human with these tiny little legs trying to run, and I'm trying to learn how to do that. It's very humbling. But with that said, I managed to get out there and do 5 miles today like if it was nothing. I did it barefoot. The only thing that I feel sore, which tells me that I'm not preparing for, is the pokey rocks because Hawaii's got some volcanic rock everywhere. And I'm just like poking on like my just jabbing into my foot. And of course I didn't prepare for that, so my feet are a little bit sore. But when I got done with the run, my delts felt like my biceps, my triceps, because of how I use them. So if you know how to use the arms, if you use the arms as a vortex, if you use your trunk as a vortex, if you use your legs as a vortex, they all reciprocate one another in a motion. If you use a cranium as a vortex, when you're running, you use them all as a system that's always assisting. It's reciprocating from one end of the spectrum to the other. And when you get those types of muscle unities in the muscle contractions, you feel an entire pump from head to toe. I'll feel it all the way in my suboccipit. I'll even feel it in my masseters, depending on how I do the technique. Now, the premise is not, I'm not telling somebody, hey, swing your arms like this or move your legs like that. The idea, this is what's awesome about it, Bret, is that I think weightlifters are gonna love me at the end of the day because I'm gonna be like, bro, we're gonna go down to bodybuilding, but we're gonna take it. It's gonna be more complicated. But when you actually do it, it's not gonna be like body. I'm not. Let me put it this way: if somebody said, "Naudi, I want to do a physique competition," I'll be like, "Go hit up Bret Contreras. This is what he does. This is. I've seen him get great results with that. So go hit him up." But if somebody told me, you know what, I want to look pretty good and I want to perform really well, I would ultimately have functional bodybuilding protocols that I do within functional patterns that respect gait. And when you mix that with the actual function of running, they kind of like build on one another. So like the resistance training that I employ with like clubs or with pulley machines and whatnot, it's not what that's why I say, Bret, I would have to show you in person. So because it's not what I've showcased online. I would have to show you. I'd be more than happy to show you. When you saw it in person, then you might be like, oh shit, this makes a lot of sense. And you'll understand the amount of trauma that I can induce on a body without having to like load them up, without having to, I'm talking about literally doing 1 rep maxes on every single exercise without having to lift a heavy load. And the way that I go about that is by, if you have myofascial restrictions on your body, we're going to battle the myofascial restrictions on your body. So if you feel like you have an imbalance, we're going to fight the imbalance coupled with the motion of a pulley machine or a kettlebell or a club, depending on what the exercise is. So going back to the whole premise is I'm trying to attain everything, Brett. And I think if you run better, if you know how to sprint better, you're going to stimulate every muscle. Your sternocleidomastoids are involved in that. Your suboccipitals are involved in that. Your platysma is involved with that. Your pec major's involved with that. Your abs, all those muscles cross those segments. I can show you on Usain Bolt that there's nothing that's really that passive when it comes to running. At some points, muscles do switch off for sure. It seems like that's the case. When we put it on EMGs, muscles do seem to switch off. But what I will say is that every muscle will get contracted if you run correctly. It's just the premise of how you're going to get a person from point A to point B to run better is the question. And that's what I've been working on, and that's what we've really been showcasing results with ultimately in the midst of all this stuff.
So, I mean, obviously, like I mean, I'm a bodybuilder, a power lifter. I don't do Olympic weightlifting, but I love watching it. I love strongman. I'm like a strength athlete guy, but if you that would be in our field like an extraordinary claim, so they require extraordinary evidence.
Yes,
If you start coming out with that, I know a lot of people would love to get out of weight. Wouldn't have to be confined to the gym and could see better results just running and things like that. Then I know you'd have people would love that. One area where I will commend you on is just kind of like being out of pain. And uh, I I've noticed I did a little experiment where I didn't squat or deadlift for a while, and I just did other movements. And then when I came back to squatting and deadlifting, I didn't lose much strength at all, like because I was out of pain and they felt good. So feeling good, well, when you're in pain, that inhibits muscle activation, and so you're never gonna build your best body or get your strongest um, if you're in pain. And I think that's something
absolutely.
that's really hard to get out of when you're obsessed with these different exercises and when you've all you know is to go to the gym and do these movement patterns. But the one thing that I've always wondered, the question I want to ask you is, do you think it's something special about your system, or the fact that you're taking them away from the gym and getting them away from this progressive overload? I have to hit a PR every
Brett,
month.
let's face it, I'm going to be biased, but with all the biases that I have, down to my soul, I try and like be as honest as I can with myself, man. But I think FP is just really special. I think at some level when you do it, there's a reason that people when they do it, they don't leave. It's like a vortex. It'll suck them in, and they're like, "Oh my god, I feel so damn good. What the hell is going on?" And it is because people think, well, those movements don't look difficult, but it's not about the movement. It's about the segments. Like if I'm going to throw a punch, there's going to come a point where my hips are going to rotate, but my ribs aren't going to rotate. Then my ribs are going to rotate, but my fist isn't going to move. And then from there, my shoulder's going to protract, but my fist isn't going to move. And now from there, the fist can fly forward. So when you understand how the specific sequences work with regard to that, in terms of when the hips are going to move with the head or whatever it may be, you're going to develop the muscle. So in terms of what gets people out of pain is not the fact that we're not challenging them. Bro, I brutalize people. I leave people. I can't say that I've got anybody to vomit because I don't think that's good. So I always hit that threshold. But bro, I can beat the crap out of somebody working out. So it's not that FP is easy to do. It's very difficult to do. It's not just from a perspective of technicalities because there's so much. So if you're talking about like moment arms and like different functions going on in the body, what I'm trying to do is talk about coordinating 10 different things at once. And when you coordinate them, those 10 different things at once, it's extremely taxing on the body, ridiculously taxing. So if sometimes we'll show like little video snippets of people absolutely struggling. What I'll do in the future, maybe I'll even send you some videos or something. I'll send it to your email and I'll show you what we can do in terms of glute activity or quad activity or adductor activity, calf activity, whatever you want. I'll get calves are a little bit tougher, but I can get the calves to fire too. I have other means of getting the calves to fire just because it's like there's so much leverage that you kind of get at the ankle joint. It's hard to load them without having a lot of weight, but there's ways of hacking that too. But the premise is that what we do is really taxing on the neuromuscular system. And if it's taxing on a level that duplicates the fatigue that you would get or the burn that you would get doing bodybuilding, minus the joint compression. So what we account for is taking a muscle to a length potential and then creating a contractile potential within that length potential. And if you're always maintaining a length potential through an entire motion, this is where I would say you get functional movement. It's hard to describe. I can't really put it into words. You think I'm a good speaker, but I don't think I'm a particularly great speaker. But I just always visualize that systems are always getting length. And since we're always operating from this perspective of length, and it's not passive length, it's not like, okay, I'm bending down and stretching and getting my hamstrings to lengthen. The idea is, how do I get my entire anterior chain to connect simultaneously with my posterior chain? How do I get them to talk to one another? And when you get them to talk to one another the right way, what you begin to realize is that your body's actually a traction suit. It's like you can create joint decompression with muscle activation. It's meant to be this way. And the way that it was, the reason it was meant to be this way, at least the reason it is this way, I don't know why it's meant to be this way. The reason that it is this way goes back to running and throwing. These are decompressive actions. Even though there is a lot of brute force when you hit the ground, or even there's a lot of brute force on the shoulder when you throw a ball, if you sequence it properly, it's all joint decompression. You're taking your lumbar whenever you throw a ball or a spear or something, and you're just taking your thoracolumbar fascia because your lats are going up and forward, and you're just going like, there's my lower back getting released. There's my hip getting released. You know, like all those things come together. So I think what gets people out of pain doing functional patterns is the fact that we're taking the active components of ranges of motion and applying them with humans, and it works really, really well. And never mind that, I actually saw you on a lecture talking about the how pain. There's two camps when it comes to pain, where you have one side where they talk about the biomechanics and the opposite side where they say it's all mental. Could you elaborate on that, Bret? Because I thought you did a really good job describing that. Could you explain that for us?
Yep. But first I wanted to, so like before I get into the pain science stuff, like when you talk about like throwing being decompressive, it's interesting. Dr. Stu McGill did a study once where he basically put a certain amount of torque, but the same amount of torque with people doing spinal flexion, spinal extension, lateral flexion, and then rotation. And the rotation, like holding that same amount of torque, it didn't get any muscle activation up extremely high, but it used the most muscles because there's no like pure rotational muscle that really like you go, oh, look at that. That's like spirals around the body. And when it contracts, it's going to twist everything. So the way the body does it, use a lot of the muscles, the obliques, and
Yeah.
you got all these different muscles and multifidi and all these different things coming, turning on together. And just in the case with the lumbar spine, because there were so many muscles, core muscles activating at once, none of them activated very highly, but they were all activating at once. That actually created the most compressive forces out of all the different joint spinal actions between spinal flexion, extension, lateral flexion, and rotation. And thinking back to when I was doing Palloff presses, I would actually do sumo stance, get a sumo stance and do a Palloff press hold for 3 seconds and come back in. I got to, on this certain cable column, I could use the whole stack and my lumbar spine would actually crack. I'm not saying that's good. It's
Obviously.
just
Hold on. Was it a subluxation or a cavitation?
I think it was cavitation. Yeah. And
so I don't know if that would be a bad thing, bro. I don't know if that's a bad thing.
But my point is, I don't know if it's good to be putting that. But my back, I don't think ever cracked from doing deadlifts, and that people think is the most, well, in the literature, the most compressive and shear forces I've ever seen was from a deadlift. That doesn't mean it's the highest. It's just the highest ever tested. I would guess that they are the highest, though. But anyway.
Well, then I want to actually just interject real quick.
Rotation in and of itself does put surprisingly high levels, but that doesn't mean it's bad.
Well, let me put it this way, Bret, because I think this is really important, brother. That people, it's like let's talk about unstable surface training. I don't do it that often. It's like it accounts for like 0.01% of my training because I spend my time doing so many other things when it comes to training. But there's some advantages that come with it, mainly just kind of finding a central balance, a center of mass. I don't use it that often, and not all stability training is equal either. But when they conducted the studies, or I think it was just a study it was one study, or how many studies was it, Bret?
there have been probably like there have been a ton of studies on that, but there was a training study by Eric Cressy showing lesser performance benefit or results compared to traditional training. That was the main paper that changed a lot of strength coaches' minds about it.
Okay, so this is what I would argue is that I don't think whoever conducted that study knew how to actually use an unstable surface training, an unstable surface, and it's not really unstable because it's connected to the ground. So at some level, it's like it's not like it's unpredictable. You can predict the pattern. If you're talking about a Dynadisc, that's a horrible tool. I would never recommend a Dynadisc. But if you're talking about a Bosu ball, I love Bosu balls. They have a lot of there's a lot of benefit that comes with the Bosu ball, but you got to know how to use it. It's like saying that boxing doesn't work because I've never boxed a day in my life, and then I try using boxing for a fight and get knocked out, and then make the correlation that boxing is an ineffective practice. I just think that when people talk about something like unstable surface training, or let's say if they talk about rotation, I genuinely don't think that they're accounting for all the factors that are involved in it, Brett, because I don't think they're like assessing it to the degree that I am. But when you
Well,
do it properly,
this happens all the time in you see a study that it says
well, the hip thrust,
uh,
right?
well, say you had a study on hip thrust and squats, and one was better for something than the other. Then people, oh, see, this is better. Do this, just do this. And you're like, well, what if you saw better results doing both? Or like, what if it was like squats versus Bulgarian split squats or lunges, and one comes out ahead, and so everyone's like, oh, see, this is better. Do this. No, you should do both of them. You'd see the better results combining them, but you have to be a good coach and know how to combine them intelligently.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now,
But let me get
actually,
back to the pain
yes,
thing you
get into
asked.
the pain. Go into the pain if you can.
So because this is important because me being like a biomechanical guy, when someone's in pain, I just always want to label them as they're dysfunctional somewhere, or like I need to fix this aspect of them, and then the pain will go away. And it's always going to be a biomechanical explanation because that's all I've ever learned is biomechanics. And so all I have is a hammer, so I'm going around looking for a nail because that's all I have. And
Yep.
so that's in my nature to that makes sense to me. This person's knee is hurting. I gotta help them help this guy not use his knees as much and use his hips more or something, Or I've got to look at his program design and have him stop doing so much knee dominant stuff or whatever. But interestingly, there's not a lot of correlation between damage and pain. So you could take 100 people and MRI them. Say you give them full body MRIs and you looked at their shoulders and their lumbar, but their discs, their intervertebral discs, their hips, their knees. You'd see all kinds of degradation and damage and herniations and these things, and it's not well correlated with the pain. With pain, you have these asymptomatic subjects who have their knees are obliterated but they feel no pain. Their hips, I think 97% of hockey players have serious labral damage on their hips. I think like 25% of people have a disc herniation, and they don't even know it. Anyway, it just shows you that you can, if something transpires gradually over time and you don't have this like acute injury, your brain could not even process it as being a threat. On the flip side, you can have someone who's in excruciating pain, and then you MRI them and nothing shows up. Under an MRI, they look fine. So for that reason, the pain researchers, they who have been studying this stuff, they acknowledge that, and they looked at a lot of other factors that can be involved. And these
What do you
are
think about this, Brett? So let's say you have a person with a lumbar, like a herniation, and then you take that portion of the spine and then you bend it. Do you think that person would feel pain then?
yeah.
You see what I'm saying? That's what I'm thinking about. Is that not like a decent correlation to draw? That it's like because you're not challenging that range of motion because your body's compensating. You're pretty much turning that place into an isometric fixed point while the rest of the body moves, and that's why you don't feel the pain. But if you were to actually challenge that range of motion, most certainly you
Yeah.
would probably feel the pain, right?
Yeah, I would think,
I would
yeah,
draw that
like if you had a
assumption.
discrimination, I would think so too. But yeah, so here's the problem. There's always a flaw with research too. It's because I sit there, my bias as a strength coach, I look at the pain guys and I'm like, all these pain research, I don't know any of them who lift heavy weights themselves or have a gym where they
Or even
do
move.
where they do progressive resistance training, and then they're saying, because they'll make statements like, you can adapt to any single movement. You could adapt to squats with your knees touching each other if you wanted. You could do round back deadlifts and adapt to it and be just fine. And I'm going, no, you can't. Like if I did that in my gym, I'd have so many injuries. And at some point, the injury has to be related to pain. And I'm sure you agree with me on that front.
Yep.
But the point isn't for me to go like abandon my biomechanical model and be totally on this side as a biopsychosocialist, the BSP model or whatever. Is to understand both sides and then choose kind of where I stand on
No.
the spectrums. And that's why it's important to know both sides and to understand that. And I'll give you an example. I remember my um, it was my stepsister's husband, and he was having excruciating back pain. And I'm like, you need to be doing, because you have a weak core, you need to be doing like side planks and like you need to get your glutes activating. And I gave him the standard advice. This was like, this must have been like 14 years ago. And in my head, I just knew it. Because this works so many times. When you have someone in pain, we start training them, their pain goes away. So I just think everyone needs this, and it got worse. Anyway, he went and got an MRI, and he found that he had something. I can't remember the exact diagnosis, but it was something where the nerve root went underneath the muscle, and when he contract that muscle, it aggravated, it made it worse. So what I was giving him made it worse, and that's because
Yep.
all I had was a hammer. In that sense, biomechanics still explained his pain, but my understanding, I didn't know enough back then to
Well,
understand
that
that.
and that's the premise of what I tell these pain researchers is like, how many dysfunctions are you even able to categorize? I mean, if you're going to talk about dysfunctions, at what level are we going to measure them? At a foot level, at an inch level, at a 16th of an inch level? Are we going to go down with a microscope and see how much compression is actually happening at a certain place? How far can we really measure it? I think that's a fundamental
I,
question: is can science really measure the compression in an area, and can the naked eye actually witness the dysfunction happening in space? And if you don't have the eye to see the dysfunction, how can you correlate that it's not biomechanically induced?
well, I'd like to challenge you on something you might not like right now. I just don't like the word dysfunction at all because it implies. Well, take Usain Bolt for example. He has a one leg that's a couple inches longer than the other, and even when he sprints, one leg is producing a lot more force than the other, and he's the fastest guy in the world. I think everyone has unique anatomy and movement patterns and things like that, and if everyone has dysfunctions, shouldn't we just be like everyone's just unique and not dysfunctional? It's just that you're better. You're going to be better at this than that. Your movement challenges are going to be this
Yeah,
instead of that.
but Brett, it's not like I'm saying that you're a bad person because you have dysfunctions. I'm just saying, hey, that doesn't work. It's
Yeah,
like
but
it could work better. It
but
could
this is
work
what the
better.
but this is what I learned from the pain scientist, and this is where I've changed in the last 5 years or so. I learned that words matter, and I'm sure you don't do this anyway, Naudi, when you have a client, but some people actually do. It's like they want to win you over with their knowledge of dysfunctions and labels, and so you'll come into them. I mean, I think the worst um, offenders of this are the rehab, the people who are working with basically anyone heavily involved in rehab, like physical therapists, manual therapists, chiropractors. Every time they get they work with a lot of my clients, and my clients come back to me 100% of the time. They say, "Oh, it turns out I've
That didn't
got
do shit. It didn't
well,
do
it turns
shit.
out I've got all this. I've got all these things wrong with me. My glutes don't activate." I'm like, "Your glutes activate fine. You know how to activate your glutes. How does he know that? He just looked at you. I have a weak core. How does he know you have a weak core? Did he test your
Well,
core? He
well, this
has
is a
you have
we
you have adhesions. How do you know if you have adhesions? You just guess.
Well, see, the thing is, what I do, Matt, is I put them on a treadmill and I take a lot of their clothes off and I say, "Hey, you see when your foot hits the ground, you see what Usain Bolt does when he runs. You see what you do. Do what Usain does." And I understand that Usain has particular. Let me put it this way, because people will be like, "Well, Usain has unique characteristics, and maybe that's what makes him great." Potentially, I'm not closed off to that, but to that
I'm
idea.
not
But if
saying
let's
the leg length discrepancy made him better. I'm just saying he was able to overcome it.
Oh,
you
I'm not
know.
saying that you can't overcome a dysfunction. What I'm saying is that what if you can overcome that dysfunction and then you get to run? That's the premise.
Well,
It's
uh,
ambitious.
no, I got my first T Nation article I wrote, uh, something that pissed off a lot of the track and field guys. I said Usain Bolt would be faster if he did hip thrusts, and it's funny because if I was Usain Bolt's coach, I guarantee you I would have been too focused on the strength and conditioning and not enough on the sprinting. And my strength and conditioning would have interfered with his sprinting, and I would have made him slower. I am
You know,
100%.
everybody, Brett, you know how many people I've talked to that are like, "Oh yeah, man, I could get Usain Bolt to run faster." I don't even make that claim. I think he runs fast
No.
enough. I'm just
Well,
kind
you
of
know
like,
what it is? I posted a blog post of his training, and he uses a lot of machines, a lot of like cables and things, and he's working out hard, but he's not pushing, he's not crushing himself, so he has energy to sprint. He's not drained. Some of my weight training sessions leave me so drained. If then you said go run, I would necessarily half out my running because I'm so wiped out. So you got to still make the focus on what you're trying to improve, and that's. But back to something I wanted to say about to close off this pain thing. When you tell someone they're dysfunctional, they have gluteomnesia. If I was like, "Oh my God, your glutes don't activate. Do you have back pain?" And they're like, "No." Well, I just planted that seed, and then maybe it's called a nocebo effect. It's the opposite of a
yep.
placebo effect. You actually manifest those symptoms because you think you're supposed to get it. And so, for that reason, I just don't. I keep it to myself. If I see someone doing something, I just keep it to myself, and I'll just give them something, and I'll
Oh,
compliment them.
same
I'm
here.
always complimenting instead of being like, "Oh my God, you are so dysfunctional. We've got to
Well,
get you
well,
out of."
I think there's nothing wrong with telling a person that they're dysfunctional as long as you show them how you're going to do it, and then you're like, "This is how we're going to solve it." Now I'm going to show you on video how we're going to do it in about 3 months, and then when you solve it, then they're like, "Oh
Yeah,
shit," which
and
is what
that,
nobody's doing.
and also to remind them like, don't worry, everyone has certain
Yeah,
dysfunction.
man, dude, we're
You
all.
make them feel, you make them
I'm a
feel
dude.
weird, like there's something wrong with me, and that's the opposite of what you want to do when you start training someone. You want them to, they're already insecure and have all these doubts, and you want to squash those doubts and insecurities and compliment and let them know you're not alone. You're not strange. You're strong. You're going to be fit. But I think a lot of people, unfortunately, they rely to these labels, and then they don't know that these labels stick. It's like when the doctor says you should never do this again, and these people, you know, believe their doctor and never exercise again because they were told that. So, which neither
Yeah.
of us do. We have to mind our words. The words we say matters.
Yeah, it's true. No, I agree. I agree because I think associations matter to words, and sometimes you gotta always be careful with that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, we could replace the dysfunction with the term imbalance and say that there's an imbalance here, where like there's not reciprocations happening in the body. Maybe we could say that and come to an agreement that that's
Yeah.
probably the better term.
Better.
But anyway, Brett, we've reached about that 90-minute mark. We didn't really actually get to cover too much of what we were talking about, bro. But I had a lot of fun actually. It was really fun talking to
Yeah,
you.
I
Uh,
didn't think we'd stick to a script, Naudi.
well, man, I appreciate everything, bro, and I apologize for any unnecessary drama. But honestly, Brett, like people went really hard on me, man, and they went really hard on me for many years, and it's like I'm. I'm the kind of guy that people are gonna say, like turn to the other cheek, and I'm gonna be like, I can't do it. It's not in me to turn the other cheek. I gotta throw punches back, and so I'm sorry that you kind of got in the middle of that. I never intended for you to get in the
Hey,
middle of that
I'm
stuff,
the same
man.
way, Naudi. I'm a fighter, and I don't. In the case with you, I don't take it personally. And it's water under the bridge. So, yeah, if hopefully we can, like, my main point with you, Naudi, is that like I like what you're trying to do with your functional pattern stuff. I have what I do. I don't see them like you do. I don't see them as one and the same like you do. I see it as, well, I'm trying to maximize someone's physique, so I use these methods. If someone
Mhm.
comes to me and they want to do another goal, then yeah, if your system had
Okay, so how about
more
how
evidence,
about this, Brett? How about this? And this is a question that I wanted to ask you. What if everybody wanted to start improving their sprinting and throwing? Would you have to change your training in order to accommodate the client?
oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So and I'm not meaning to be offensive here. So you're just going to ultimately just serve the client based upon where they're at instead of because what I'm talking about, I think that running is a biological need. Just like your LDL and your HDL needs to be at certain levels, and your blood pressure needs to be at a certain level at certain times. I think that there are biomechanical needs that need to be made or met with all people, and I think that running and walking and throwing, I think these are markers that people need to have. Do you think that at some point you might even just mix some of that stuff in for the sake of trying to get your clients more sustainability as you move forward?
So I'm not where you are on that, but this is why I came up with my force vector concept. It's like, I mean, I do a lot of stuff in the sagittal plane, but I always also do stuff I look at things in vectors. So it's like you've got up and down, your
Yep.
vertical, you've got forward and backward, your horizontal, you've got your left to right, your lateral, and then you've got your torsional or rotational. And I make sure to have all of those that I train in the weight room. Now, if I wanted to make them athletic, I'd need to be doing sprinting drills, acceleration drills, agility drills, med ball work, all these things.
Hmm.
But I like to think that I'm at least going halfway there by strengthening we give them cable rotational exercises, we give them lateral exercises, and at least we're performing the movement patterns to get the muscles strong. That way, I'm at least laying a good foundation if they want to go down that path.
Okay, I see where you're coming from, but yeah, man, I do appreciate you coming on, and if I'm in San Diego, maybe I'll hit you up, and I'll just show you what I'm doing, and like at my end,
Yeah.
I'm grateful that you came down,
And if
Brett.
I'm in Hawaii, vice versa.
If you're in Kauai, because that's specifically where I'm at. If you're ever in Kauai, you are always welcome to come by, bro, and come check out what we do. I'd love to just. I mean, you can come by. We could bounce off ideas, whatever. Maybe you can help me with these damn EMGs because I'm not like I'm not so astute with these types of things. So you never know, man. We hopefully at some point we can meet up, and I'm just glad that we're able to kind of like close this book and then come to an amicable conclusion as to the supposed conflict that we had with one another.
Yep, I agree. Totally agree.
Hell yeah, brother. Well, hopefully we'll be in touch. I wish you the best, brother. Have a great day, Brett, and thanks for stopping in, man.
You too, Naudi. Thanks, man.
Take care, brother.